The words of a former compliance officer with American Higher Education Development Corporation led to major drops in reported graduation rates from several Midwest schools.
I spoke with the whistleblower's attorney, who says if there's money on the table, unfortunately, some will do anything to take it.
What AHED, the defendant, was doing was manipulating the graduation rates for their for-profit schools that they owned and operated, including Rockford Career College.
Serious allegations against American Higher Education Development, or AHED, brought forward by a former employee.
Those graduation rates were disclosed to their accreditor and to the public, and what they were doing was they were manipulating the statistics in a scheme that they called reverse starts.
Bill Myers, a partner at Chicago law firm Goldberg Cohn, says the alleged scheme focused on the number of students enrolled in 3 of AHED's colleges.
What they did was they reduced the number of people that they claimed were in the class to begin with, or the program to begin with, and that made the numbers, the percentage that graduated, look much better than it actually was.
At Rockford Career College, AHED reported over 94% of its students in its programs in 2021 actually graduated. A year later, that percentage topped 95%. But in 2023, shortly after the whistleblower came forward, only 20 of the college's 26 programs hit the mark.
So they went from saying somewhere between 94 and 95% of students who are in these programs graduate, down to 76%.
Myers says colleges and universities must publish graduation rates to receive federal dollars, and AHED did that, sort of.
They got continued access to federal student aid, and they also, through maintaining their accreditation, and they also got the benefit of what were false but rosy-looking graduation statistics in the minds of potential students who might enroll.
Goldberg Cohn insists these colleges knew what they were doing.
And so this was a very purposeful, systematic effort on behalf of the schools that they operated to modify and to manipulate the graduation rates.
In early July, AHED agreed to pay more than $1 million to resolve the complaint. That money will be shared between the Department of Education and the whistleblower, former AHED Chief Operating and Compliance Officer Christopher Wargo.
There were instances where students who had actually been at the school for a period of time and who had paid some portion of their tuition and then were eliminated as part of this reverse start scheme, never got their money back.
Wargo claims the company wouldn't let him correct the data.
And Mr. Wargo was hired by AHED as its chief operating officer in the fall of 2023. And during his tenure, he discovered this reverse start scheme, and he slowly, working with staff at the schools, began to understand the extent of it, the scope of it.
And so he resigned.
Initially, they told him it wasn't. Ultimately, they admitted to him that it was, and through a combination of sort of begging him not to proceed or to go to the authorities or to file a claim, and then ultimately threatening him, but refusing really to fix and to correct their statistics, he decided that he had no choice but to resign. And he came to us, and we ended up filing this complaint on his behalf.
According to Myers, Wargo got more than $227,000 in the settlement. As for the students missing their federal aid money, Myers says get an attorney.
Certainly the students can contact the Department of Education in Washington. They could also contact State Attorney General.
Initially, AHED did not admit to any wrongdoing, but in the fall of 2025, the company posted revised graduation stats from 2019 to 2023, a result Myers says Wargo wanted all along.
They suggested that this was the result of their own internal investigation and that they made this decision to restate their graduation rates. Anybody that reads that would likely be misled into believing that they really did this on their own.
WIFR reached out to AHED and Rockford Career College for comment, but did not hear back from either.
You can find previous coverage of the lawsuit on RockfordNewsFirst.com.